So I want to start with a story, and I need you to really picture this because it matters. It is January 2020, a Thursday afternoon in Detroit, and a man named Robert Williams is pulling into his driveway after a long day at work. His two young daughters see him through the window and they come running out, excited, the way little kids do when Dad gets home. And before he can even hug them, two police officers step out from a cruiser parked at the curb, walk up to him on his own front lawn and put him in handcuffs while those girls stand there watching. They held him for 30 hours in a detention cell, slid a blurry surveillance photo across the table, and said, "Is this you?" And Robert Williams, who is not a stupid man, looked at that grainy image and said something that would almost be funny if it were not so devastating. He said, "I hope you don't think all black people look alike," because the face in that photo was not his face. A facial recognition algorithm had matched him to a shoplifting suspect from a surveillance camera, and the match was wrong, and nobody in that entire chain of command bothered to verify it with their own eyes before they drove to his house and arrested him in front of his children.
And that story is genuinely awful. I am not going to sit here and minimize what happened to Robert Williams, because what happened to him was a failure on every level. But I want to be really careful about what lesson we draw from it, because here's what actually went wrong in that case. It was not just the algorithm, it was the fact that the detectives treated a computer match as a confirmed identification instead of as a lead, which is what it is supposed to be. The technology flagged a possible match from a terrible image, and then human beings made the choice to skip every verification step and go straight to an arrest. That is a policing failure, a training failure, a procedure failure. If a human eyewitness had picked the wrong guy out of a lineup, we would not be talking about banning eyewitness testimony, we would be talking about fixing the procedures around it. So the question I keep coming back to is whether we are conflating a tool that needs better guardrails with a tool that should not exist at all, and those are very different conversations.
See, that reframing is exactly what worries me, because it puts the burden of perfection on every police department in every city and every encounter, and we know that is not how things work in practice. Robert Williams is not the only case. There have been at least 7 documented wrongful arrests tied to facial recognition in the United States, and those are just the ones we know about, the ones where someone had the resources and the knowledge to challenge what happened. How many people just took the plea deal because they could not afford to fight it? The technology is being deployed right now today with those same procedural gaps, and telling me that the fix is better training is like telling me the fix for a car with no brakes is better drivers. At some point, you have to ask whether the machine itself is the problem.
And at some point you have to ask what happens to the cases that do get solved. There are missing children who have been found because of facial recognition. There are human trafficking victims who have been identified at border crossings. There are serial offenders who have been caught after years. I'm not saying those outcomes justify what happened to Robert Williams, but I am saying that when we talk about banning this technology entirely, we need to be honest about what we are also giving up, because those families never make the headlines the same way.
Okay, so let us zoom out from individual cases and talk about what this looks like at scale, because I think that is where the real terror lies. China has installed over 600 million surveillance cameras across the country, and that number is probably higher by now, and they have built what is arguably the most sophisticated facial recognition infrastructure on the planet. And what are they doing with it? Well, among other things, they are using it to track Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province. Cameras that specifically flag Uyghur facial features, that monitor who goes to mosque, who talks to whom, that feed into a system of mass detention that the international community has called a genocide. That is not a hypothetical slippery slope. That is a machine that exists right now, that is running right now, that is sorting human beings by their ethnicity, using the same core technology that we are talking about putting in American police departments.
And I hear you, and China's surveillance state is genuinely terrifying, but here's where I think that comparison actually makes my argument for me rather than yours. If democracies refuse to develop and regulate facial recognition, if we just ban it and walk away, who do you think sets the global standards for how it gets built and deployed? It is going to be China. It is going to be Russia. It is going to be regimes that have zero interest in civil liberties, or algorithmic fairness, or any of the things we care about. They are already exporting their surveillance technology to dozens of countries across Africa and Southeast Asia, and those systems come with no privacy protections, no accuracy requirements, no oversight mechanisms whatsoever. So the choice is not between facial recognition existing and not existing. That ship has sailed. The choice is between democracies shaping how this technology evolves or authoritarian regimes doing it for us, and I know which world I would rather live in.
That is the "if we don't build the bomb, someone else will" argument. And I have to say it has never sat well with me because it assumes that the only way to influence a technology is to adopt it yourself. Europe has taken a much more restrictive approach through their AI Act, and they are still at the table for global standards conversations. You can regulate without embracing. You can set norms without deploying. And frankly, the idea that American police departments using facial recognition somehow constrains what China does with its cameras in Xinjiang is a fantasy. Those are completely decoupled systems with completely different goals. What is not a fantasy is the very real infrastructure being built in American cities. Thousands of cameras networked together, and the question of what happens when a less scrupulous administration inherits that infrastructure, because every surveillance system ever built has eventually been turned against the people it was supposed to protect.
But you are also ignoring the surveillance infrastructure we have already accepted without this debate. Every major city has automatic license plate readers that track where your car goes. Your cell phone pings off towers that log your movements throughout the day, and we carry devices with GPS that could reconstruct our entire lives if subpoenaed. We did not have some grand national conversation about any of that. It just crept in, and now it is everywhere. So when people draw the line specifically at facial recognition, I sometimes wonder if it is because this one feels more personal, more visceral, more like something out of a dystopian movie, rather than because it is categorically different from the surveillance we have already normalized.
Let me tell you about a study that came out of MIT's Media Lab, because I think the numbers here tell a story that is hard to argue with. Researchers tested commercial facial recognition systems from major companies, and what they found was staggering: error rates of up to 35% for dark-skinned women, meaning the system got it wrong more than a third of the time, and for light-skinned men, near perfect accuracy. So what we are talking about is not a system that makes mistakes randomly. It is a system that makes mistakes along the exact same lines of race and gender that have plagued policing for centuries. You could not design a more perfect engine for reinforcing existing bias if you tried. Every single wrongful arrest case I have seen linked to facial recognition has involved a black person being misidentified, and at some point that pattern stops being a coincidence and starts being an indictment.
So the MIT study was a landmark moment, and it absolutely exposed real problems that the industry needed to confront. But here's what happened after that study came out: it actually worked. The companies whose systems were tested went back and rebuilt their training datasets. They diversified their image libraries, they retrained their models, and the accuracy gaps narrowed significantly. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, has been running the most comprehensive facial recognition testing program in the world, and their more recent evaluations show that the top-performing algorithms have dramatically reduced the demographic disparities. They have not eliminated them entirely, that is true, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But the trajectory matters, because if we had banned the technology after the MIT study, we would never have seen that improvement. And the lesson I take from that is that pressure, transparency, and accountability can actually make these systems better in ways that matter.
The trajectory matters, sure, but trajectory does not help Robert Williams when he is sitting in that cell. The improvement from 35% error to even 5% error still means that in a city like Detroit, with its demographics, you are going to have thousands of false matches if you run this at any real scale. And here is what really keeps me up at night. The people most likely to be misidentified are the same people who are already over-policed, who already have less access to legal representation, who already face an uphill battle in every interaction with the criminal justice system. You are layering a flawed technology on top of a flawed system and asking me to trust that the combination will somehow produce fair outcomes. Show me the jurisdiction where that has worked and I will reconsider.
And I think you are imagining a deployment model that does not have to be the default. What if the rule is that facial recognition can never be the sole basis for any police action, that it can only be used to generate leads that must be independently verified through traditional investigation, and that every match has to be reviewed by a trained analyst before it goes anywhere? What if there are mandatory accuracy thresholds, mandatory demographic audits, mandatory reporting of every false match? I am describing regulations that do not exist yet in most places, and they should, but the absence of good regulation is not an argument against the technology, it is an argument for better governance.
I want to talk about consent because I think this is the piece that gets lost in the accuracy debate. When you walk down a public street and a camera captures your face and runs it through a database, you have not consented to that identification. You did not opt in. You were not informed. There is no terms of service you clicked through, no checkbox you ticked, nothing. Your face is being used as a biometric identifier without your knowledge or agreement. And there is something fundamentally different about that than a police officer recognizing you because they have seen your mugshot. This is silent, invisible, constant, and it works at a scale that no human surveillance system could ever match. Every face in a crowd, every person walking past a camera, instantly identified and logged. The question is not whether we are comfortable with that today. It is whether we want to build a world where opting out of being identified in public is simply not possible.
Okay, but here's where I am going to push back, and I know this one is going to annoy you. Roughly 2 billion people on this planet unlock their phones with their face multiple times a day. They set it up voluntarily, they love the convenience, and they barely think about it. We hand our biometric data to Apple and Google and Samsung without a second thought, and those companies store it, process it, and use it as a core feature of their products. So when people say facial recognition is inherently a violation of privacy, I want to know where that energy is when they are looking at their iPhone to check their messages. I am not saying the police use case is identical to the phone use case, because it obviously is not, but I am saying that the outrage is selective in ways that suggest this is more about who is doing the looking than about the fundamental act of facial identification itself.
And I think you just made my point for me because the entire difference is choice. When I set up Face ID on my phone, I am choosing to let that device recognize me, and the biometric data stays on the device, and I can turn it off anytime I want. That is informed, voluntary, reversible consent. A surveillance camera on a street corner offers me none of those things. I did not choose it. I cannot opt out of it. And I have no idea what happens to the data afterward, who sees it, how long it is stored, whether it gets shared across agencies or sold to third parties. Comparing those two situations is like comparing someone who voluntarily gives blood at a donation center to someone who gets their blood drawn without their knowledge while they sleep. The substance is the same. The act is fundamentally different, and the difference is consent.
Fair enough, and I take your point about the consent distinction. But let me ask you this, do you object to security cameras in general? Because we have had cameras in public spaces for decades, and the footage gets reviewed, and people get identified from that footage through manual review all the time. Is the objection really about the identification, or is it about the speed and scale at which it now happens? Because if the concern is automation rather than the act itself, then what we are really debating is efficiency. And I find it strange to argue that a technology is acceptable when it is slow and unreliable, but becomes unacceptable when it gets fast and accurate.
So here is where I land on this, and I want to be honest that I do not have a clean answer because I do not think one exists. The technology is real, it is improving, and it is not going away. But I think we need to start from a position of deep skepticism rather than cautious optimism, because the consequences of getting this wrong fall disproportionately on people who already bear the heaviest burdens in our society. I would want to see an outright moratorium on real-time facial recognition in public spaces until we have federal legislation that establishes accuracy standards, consent frameworks, demographic auditing requirements, and meaningful penalties for misuse. Not guidelines, not best practices, actual law with actual teeth. And I would want independent oversight that includes the communities most affected by this technology, not just technologists and police departments designing the rules for themselves.
And I think a moratorium is actually a reasonable starting point for the conversation, as long as it is genuinely temporary and tied to specific legislative milestones rather than becoming a de facto permanent ban. Because here's what I worry about. I worry that the perfect becomes the enemy of the good, that we spend a decade debating federal legislation while the technology develops overseas without any of our input, and that by the time we re-engage, the global standards have been set by regimes that do not care about any of the values we have been arguing about. I want robust regulation. I want accuracy thresholds. I want demographic audits. I want consent mechanisms. I want all of it. But I also want us to acknowledge that a tool which can find missing children, identify victims of trafficking, and solve violent crimes has genuine value that we should not casually discard. The challenge is building a framework that captures that value while protecting the Robert Williamses of the world. And I think that is hard but not impossible if we actually commit to doing the work.
I hope you are right. But I think about those two little girls watching their father get handcuffed on his own lawn, and I cannot help feeling that we are running an experiment on real people's lives while we figure out the rules, and the people in that experiment did not volunteer for it. That is the part I cannot get past.
And I think about the parents of a missing child getting a phone call that their kid has been found at a truck stop 3 states away because a camera flagged a face, and I cannot get past that either. We are both haunted by different outcomes of the same technology, and the honest answer is that we need a system smart enough to deliver the second story without creating the first, and we are not there yet, but giving up on getting there feels like its own kind of failure.